Hi everyone and welcome to the internet. What we're going to be doing in our biology lesson today is having a look at the carbon cycle. So hopefully by the end of today's lesson you'll be able to describe the carbon cycle and explain the different processes that occur within it. To start us off, we've got a couple of questions based around the work we did in our previous lesson. So in your books, have a go at answering those two questions for me. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to do that. Let's mark those answers then. So the first one, the types of bacteria we find in the nitrogen cycle are nitrifying bacteria, nitrogen fixing bacteria, denitrifying bacteria and decomposers. Give yourself a mark for each of those that you got right. Question 2, we had some definitions and you had to match it to the correct term from the water cycle this time. So loss of water vapour from the aerial parts of a plant is transpiration. Water falling as rain is precipitation. Water trickling through gaps in rocks and soil, that's percolation. Liquid water turning into water vapour is evaporation. And water vapour turning into liquid water droplets is condensation. So give yourself a total out of 9 for those two questions and write that in your books for me. 30 seconds, just see if you can finish off this sentence for me. The carbon cycle is. Write down your thoughts in your book for me. Hopefully we were able to think back to the work we've done on the water cycle and the nitrogen cycle to just apply that same principle to the carbon cycle. Quite simply, the carbon cycle is the process by which carbon is cycled through the atmosphere, the earth, plants and animals. If you didn't get that definition, then write it down now. I'll leave it up for about 30 more seconds. So this is the carbon cycle then. Now, before you all frantically try and scribble down wonderful diagrams of cows and the like, I will put a copy of this up on my website so you can get a copy later on. Now, what we've actually got here then is the diagram that shows us everything and how it all links together to cycle that carbon through all of those different areas. So if we start off at the top of the diagram, we've got carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Hopefully we remember that the atmosphere is about 0.04% carbon dioxide. Now you'll notice there's only one arrow pointing away from the atmosphere, and that's on the far right hand side where we've got that arrow labelled photosynthesis. So the only process that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is photosynthesis. So at that point we're going to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into things like glucose in our plants through the process of photosynthesis. From our plants we can see there's two options. We could have obviously the decomposition going into the ground, or we could have it being passed to the animals. Now remember, plants get eaten by animals, so that will then have a feeding relationship moving along the chain there. We will notice that there are three other arrows pointing up back into the clouds again. So we've got one from the tree, one from the animal, and then one from the ground. They're all labelled the same thing, respiration. So plants, animals, and our microorganisms involved in decay, these are all able to carry out respiration. So that's why we've got respiration from three different sources. What we also find is that from the cow, we've also got an arrow labelled decomposition. So plants die and break down, animals die and break down. So decomposition from those 2 points. What we then find is that this carbon from the decaying matter and waste over millions of years can get turned into fossil fuels. And then we'll dig those fossil fuels out of the ground millions of years later, and we will burn them in a process called combustion, which hopefully we remember releases carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere again. What I'd like you to do then is, in your books, write down our first part of our sentence. Carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere by, and then write down those three processes that release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Once you've got those three processes written down, see if you can explain what is meant by each of those processes. And there's one of them that you should be able to write down, both the word equation and the balanced symbol equation. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to have a go at this. Fill out the three processes, explain what is meant by each of them, and then for one you should be able to do the word and balanced symbol equation for me. So let's mark that work then. The three processes are respiration, combustion, and decomposition. So any of those three, give yourself a tick for each one you got right. In terms of what they are then, let's start with respiration. Hopefully we remember from B1 that respiration is the process that living organisms use to transfer energy to ATP. So our word equation is oxygen plus glucose makes carbon dioxide plus water. And remember, when we write a word equation, we've got to use the full words. You can't abbreviate things like carbon dioxide down to CO2 for a word equation. You won't get the mark. Then the balanced symbol equation 6O2 plus C6H12O6 makes 6CO2 and 6H2O. So remember our rule for balancing this one, it's 6 is in front of everything except the glucose. The second one, burning, is our combustion. So what we find there is you might have explained combustion as the burning of fossil fuels, for example, and on the exam, if you were to write down burning instead of combustion, you're still going to get the mark. And our third one, decomposition, that's where we're breaking down dead organisms by the action of those decomposers. So if you didn't get those, make sure you fill them in now. I'll leave that up there for just about 30 seconds more. The next thing we need to write down then is the name of the process that removes the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So write down the top part of the sentence, fill in the missing name, and then the bit at the bottom tells us where this occurs in green plants, algae, and phytoplankton. Once you've got those points written down, what I'd like you to do is write the word and balanced symbol equation for that process for me. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to get that done. Hopefully we remembered from our diagram that the only process to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is photosynthesis. And hopefully from our work back in B1, we remember that photosynthesis happens in green plants, algae, and phytoplankton. In terms of the word equation, it's just the opposite of what we said for respiration. Carbon dioxide plus water makes glucose and oxygen. And the balanced symbol equation, 6CO2 plus 6H2O, makes C6H12O6 plus 6O2. Obviously give yourself a tick for any of those bits you got right and give yourself a score out of 3 for that part of the work. If we think back to the work we did in B1, you'll notice this is a recurring theme of today's lesson, then what you will actually find is we did some work about what happens to glucose that we make in photosynthesis. So what I want you to do is, in your books, write down anything that you can remember happens to the glucose made in photosynthesis. A bullet point list is fine for this one. So I'll give you about a minute to do this. Hopefully, the key thing we've got here is that glucose can be used to make complex molecules. So we can join lots of glucose together to make things like starch, for example. We can also use that glucose and combine it with other elements to make things like proteins and fats. Now, because we're making these biological molecules that are the building blocks of living things, then what we're going to see is that plants are then able to grow and increase their biomass as a result of making this glucose. So make sure you've got those 3 sentences written down in your books for me. If we think back to the diagram I showed you towards the beginning of the lesson on the carbon cycle, how is carbon transferred from plants to animals? Write me an answer to that question in your books as a sentence as well. Don't just write a single word, otherwise it will make no sense to you later on. So 1 sentence, how is carbon transferred from plants to animals? Hopefully what we wrote down is that they're going to be eaten by the animals. So whenever we're looking at how the carbon compounds are going to move from the plants to the animals, it's by the process of feeding or by eating. Now what we will find is then, after they've been eaten, then some of the carbon from the plants will become molecules that increase the biomass of the animal. So this is how we're moving that carbon through our food chain, through those eating relationships that we've seen through food chains. So make sure those 2 sentences are in your books. Next thing I'd like you to have a go at doing is answering these two questions. So suggest why carbon dioxide levels vary, firstly throughout the 24-hour day, and secondly over hundreds of years. Now, if you've watched the daily government briefings, then this might be a bit of a hint for you at the moment about what's happening and why we might see changes in carbon dioxide levels, but also think about other things that could cause changes in carbon dioxide levels across a 24-hour period and over hundreds of years. Write those answers in your book for me. I'll give you a couple of minutes. Let's start off with the variation over a 24-hour period first of all. Now, the main reason that we see this variation in carbon dioxide levels over a 24-hour period is because obviously a proportion of it, and depending on what time of the year, depends on how much of it, is going to be darkness. Hopefully we remember that photosynthesis requires sunlight in order to take place, therefore overnight we will not have photosynthesis happening. That means we won't be removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at night. So what we'll see is that the carbon dioxide levels will be a little bit lower during the daylight hours because photosynthesis removes the carbon dioxide, and slightly higher overnight because there's no photosynthesis. If we then think about the longer period of time, so if we're thinking about over many hundreds of years, for example, then there are a lot of factors that we could put in here. So if we're thinking about those daily press briefings we're getting from the government at the moment, then one of their favourite charts to start off with is the one about transport use. So the use of transport is one of those key things that's going to cause those changes over hundreds of years. Because what we've seen is recently, when everyone's staying at home, then the levels have dropped right off. Now you go back just 100 years, there weren't anywhere near as many cars on the road as there are today. So that means we'd have far lower levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because we're not releasing it from the cars. If you go back further than that, then we'd have very, very few sort of pollutant generating industries. So we wouldn't have the big factories and so on pre the Industrial Revolution, for example. We wouldn't have anywhere near the levels of carbon dioxide being generated by our human activities. So when we're talking hundreds of years, think about human activity. So the graph I've given you on the screen here just shows you these fluctuations. So it starts just about 1960 and goes through to approximately 2010. And what you can see is we're getting those little rises and falls, which is the seasonal variations that we've got, and we've also got that increasing trend across that period. And that's down to, obviously, the human activities. So what I want you to do, bullet point list of any activities, that humans are carrying out and what their impacts may be on the carbon dioxide. Hopefully we did put in here about industry and cars which are going to be releasing carbon dioxide. We could have put in burning fossil fuels in general, releasing carbon dioxide. We might also have put in things like deforestation from our geography knowledge, which is obviously going to reduce the amount of photosynthesis that can occur. Any of these activities that cause an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are valid answers there. Just to finish off today then, we've got our plenary question. So those of you with target grades up to a grade 5, the 2 on the left. Target grade over a grade 5, it's the 2 on the right. So I'll leave this up for a couple of minutes today, but if you think you're going to need longer, obviously just pause the video. As always, you can find the answers to the plenary over on my website, sciencewright.weebly.com. You'll also be able to find that under the Internet tab. Just select the week that we're in, and then you'll be able to find things like the lesson PowerPoints, the answers to the plenary, any additional work, and if there's any little experiments I thought you could do at home, then they're there too. So have a look and get using that.